Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Knack at Home program. My name is David Zyla. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function for any questions that you may have. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome and first introduce our guest today. Andrew Yamato heads the North American operation for the 156-year-old British menswear firm of New and Lingwood and manages their shop on the Upper East Side. Prior to that, he worked for custom clothier and menswear author Alan Flusser, with whom he produced several events for the National Arts Club Fashion Speak Fridays series. He has previously worked as a museum curator, an educational producer for PBS, and as a freelance writer and filmmaker with a focus on the history and aesthetics of classic menswear. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, David. I'm very happy to be back here tonight. I've enjoyed many Fashion Speak Friday presentations over the years, and I definitely consider the National Arts Club to be the best forum for menswear culture here in New York. This has always been a very game audience you have here, and I'm just sorry I can't see everyone today. I'm sure, judging from past events, that a lot of you are in the spirit tonight in your dressing gowns and jammies. I myself am here in the upstairs lounge of New and Lingwood's shop on the Upper East Side, where I've rigged up a few of our mannequins with loungewear from our collection. We may get around to talking about those later. But first, I wanted to start out by defining tonight's subject. Okay, what is classic loungewear? Traditionally, for me, there is daywear. That's suits, jackets, trousers, basically everyday clothes. Then there is evening wear, by which we generally mean tuxes and tails, almost always black or midnight blue, and generally characterized by all sorts of bells and whistles that mainly serve to distinguish it from day wear. In other words, trousers get a silk stripe, jackets get silk facings, that sort of thing. If you were of the costume changing class back in the day, this is what you dressed in after 6 for dinner, whether you were at home or out on the town. Finally, there is loungewear, which is defined not so much by time of day as by context. These are clothes for the home. That's their purpose and the essence of their appeal. Now, in my definition, classic loungewear has 3 main attributes. First and foremost, it has to be comfortable. Obviously, clothes to sleep and lounge in have to be. Second, it's intimate. These are clothes that are worn only around your family and your closest friends. And finally, it's extravagant. Loungewear is exempt from social standards of modesty and dress, so you're free to go a bit crazy. Not mandatory, but you're kind of missing the point if you don't get a lot of color and pattern into that. Note that we're not talking about t-shirts and sweatpants here. I don't think this crowd was too into that, but those might be comfortable, but they are not extravagant. And we're also not talking about lingerie, which might be intimate, but isn't necessarily comfortable, or so I'm told. We're talking about the classic elements of traditional male loungewear: dressing gowns, smoking jackets, pajamas, slippers, and headwear. Now, I should mention that most of these items have never been restricted to men, but given our limited time and my limited expertise in women's wear, I'll be focusing on men's loungewear tonight. So I'm going to start a little slideshow to give you something to look at besides me here. Hold on a second. Share screen. Here we go. How's that? Can you all see that? All right. So I'm going to start with the flagship garment of the genre, the dressing gown. So long flowing robes have been worn since antiquity all around the world. In their simplest form, they are some of the simplest garments to make, and virtually every culture has them. The classic Western dressing gown as we know it today really dates back to the 17th century when the Dutch East India Company and later the British East India Company started importing banyans from India. Now, banyan is a Hindu word that translates to merchant, and this is what they looked like. These are long, square-cut, T-shaped garments, often made from rich and sumptuous fabrics like silk or cashmere, sometimes closed with a sash belt, that were intended to be worn at home over one's regular attire. These became especially popular in the 18th century as enlightened leisure garments. Now, at the time, typical male dress for a Western gentleman, and we are talking about men of means at this point in the story, generally consisted of stockings, a close-fitting three-piece suit in wool or silk, a lace cravat or linen neckcloth, and a powdered wig. Very exquisite, but made for courtly presentation and not the most comfortable costume man has ever worn. Now, here comes this drapey, flowing, abundant silk garment with all the exotic charm and mysterious sensuality that the East had always represented to the West since antiquity. Sophisticated gentlemen embrace this Orientalist decadence in the comfort and privacy of their homes, casting aside their coats and wigs for banyans and soft Eastern-inspired caps and turbans. The American founding father and dedicated robe rocker, Benjamin Rush, observed that, quote, loose dresses contribute to the easy and vigorous exercise of the faculties of the mind. This remark is so obvious and so generally known that we find studious men are always painted in gowns when they are seated in their libraries. Thus we see Rush's friend, Ward Nicholas Boylston, in his study on the left, and no less a figure than Sir Isaac Newton in his. The neoclassical architecture in Newton's portrait also reminds us of how much these men revered ancient Greece and Rome, and their loose robes were also intended to evoke the chitons and togas of classical antiquity's heroes, statesmen, and philosophers. This was, of course, not just the age of reason, but the age of romanticism and the age of revolution. The loose fit and the exotic fabrics of the banyan perfectly complemented the sensual, open-collared, bare-chested aesthetic of young poets, adventurers, and revolutionaries. Most infamously, the mad, bad, and dangerous to know Lord Byron, pictured here with one of his many beautiful Italian paramours. By the Regency era at the turn of the 19th century, the loose T-shaped robe-like banyans that had been imported from the East were being replaced by more westernized garments, still ankle length, but more tightly fitted with a more flaring skirt, set-in sleeves, standing collars, and front button or toggle closures that effectively made them housecoats. This was the time of what menswear historians often call the Great Renunciation in men's style. Led by the English dandy and all-around miscreant Beau Brummel, fashionable gentlemen throughout Europe gave up colorful and highly ornamented silk clothes for sober suits in dark wool, distinguished by fine cut rather than florid ostentation. This is the fundamental aesthetic that has prevailed ever since in traditional menswear, and this was the era in which London's Savile Row established itself as the global center of men's style, which to many of us, it remains. Now, for all his faults, Brummel is a really fascinating figure, and I think a bit misunderstood today. We tend to think of a dandy as interchangeable with fop, in other words, a man who dresses too flamboyantly. In fact, the Brummelian dandy, and by extension all Western gentlemen in the 19th century, was exactly the opposite, embracing an elegant minimalism in dress rather than gorgeousness. This is very well summed up in Brummel's most famous sartorial maxim that, quote, if John Bull turns around to look at you, you are not well dressed, but either too stiff, too tight, or too fashionable. In this new, strictly conservative sartorial context, the dressing gown became even more important as a comfortable domestic indulgence of color and luxury. They got increasingly elaborate, with shells of paisley patterned silk, jewel-toned wool, and heavy cotton velvet, linings and lapels of quilted silk, and intricate frogging and embroidery. We have to remember that these thick dressing gowns were also highly practical in an era before central heating, effectively being wearable blankets that men bundled up in at least half the year, often with quilted smoking caps and Albert slippers made from matching or similar fabrics. A Victorian gentleman wearing such an undress ensemble could receive visitors at home without inviting scandal, which certainly wouldn't have been the case if he were in his shirt sleeves, which was considered underwear. One figure I'd like to zoom in on for a moment is Sherlock Holmes. Being the ultimate high Victorian man of intellect, culture, and sophistication, with a somewhat decadent taste for morphine and cocaine, Holmes was the quintessential dressing gown wearer, and he is often depicted in one, puffing away as he pieces together his latest mystery in the heavily upholstered comfort of his home. He exemplifies the notion that the Victorian dressing gown wearer is not particularly a man of action, but a man of power at his leisure. Loungewear has always been adjacent to evening wear. And when evening tails started being informalized in the latter half of the 19th century with the introduction of the shorter tuxedo, so too did the smoking jacket emerge as a cut-down version of the dressing gown. This more modern garment could be worn casually over day clothes or worn with a bow tie as an element of evening wear. This was an era when dressing formally for dinner was mandatory for the upper classes, and a smoking jacket gained grudging acceptance at the table. A few words now about those other elements of the classic Victorian loungewear ensemble. The pillbox smoking cap, as it survived to the present, is a very well-preserved artifact of 19th century English upper-class smoking culture. One of several styles popular at the time, along with looser turbans and stocking caps, it was generally made of wool, cotton velvet, or silk with a quilted lining. It usually featured a silk tassel, somewhat resembled a squat Turkish fez, and reflected the ongoing British imperial fashion for all things Eastern. Similar caps were worn by the British Army in this era. The one on the right is a modern New England model worn with one of our dressing gowns. Along with the smoking jacket or a dressing gown, the smoking cap was worn after dinner at home when a gentleman and his male guests would retire to his study to discuss manly things over brandy and cigars. In theory, the cap and jacket would absorb the smoke and keep the wearer from repulsing his wife later that evening. The primary footwear element of Victorian loungewear was the Albert slipper, so named for the beloved German-born prince consort of Queen Victoria, who popularized them in their platonic form. Stacked leather heel, leather sole, velvet upper, grosgrain trim, quilted lining, and often an embroidered monogram, family crest, or other design. They were descended from the dainty, low-vamp pumps worn by aristocrats and officials at European courts in the 18th century. And like those shoes, they were intended to be worn inside. Their trim shape created the appearance of a small foot, which, as you can see from the illustration on the right, was prized to the point of fetishization in the 19th century. Albert slippers might not seem especially comfortable compared to more modern styles, but to men who wear heeled shoes, dress shoes during the day, the fact that it has a heel that supports that same foot position actually makes them quite comfortable. Its leather sole also means that it can make excursions outside. And in the 20th century, they've come to be accepted footwear not only with evening clothes, but as a chic element of more casual outfits. As you can see in these examples, despite their highfalutin origins, there's nothing inherently fusty about Albert slippers. Worn with more relaxed clothing, with or without socks, they're easy and elegant, conjuring comfort and confidence. Now, throughout this presentation, I've been referring to the home as the natural habitat for loungewear, but historically there was a major exception to this rule. A gentleman's metropolitan social club was his home away from home, a wood-paneled, leather-furnished, all-male preserve of his peers, and he often kept a smoking jacket and slippers there to enjoy as he would at home. Because the clubs also offered rooms and apartments for overnight and extended stays, he probably also kept a pair of pajamas there as well. Pajamas as we know them today actually have a very similar history to the dressing gown. They were first imported to the West by British merchants in the latter 19th century from India, where similar two-piece garments of light cotton had been worn as regular clothing since antiquity and still to this day. Extremely comfortable compared to what Europeans were wearing, matching two-piece pajamas were gradually adopted in the West as sleeping clothes. The word itself is an anglicization of the Hindi pajama, literally leg garment. Now, being a two-piece garment, often made in colorful fabrics, decoratively piped, and trimmed with pockets, Pajamas were far more presentable and sophisticated than the traditional long nightshirt or one-piece knit union suit, which were both definitely underwear and increasingly old-fashioned. Funny little anecdote before I move on. In the 1886 glossary of the colloquial Anglo-Indian words and phrases, there's a story about how, quote, the late Mr. B, tailor in Jermyn Street, that's in London, some on 40 years ago, in reply to a question why pajamas had feet sewn onto them, as was sometimes the case with those furnished by London outfitters, answered, I believe, sir, it is because of the white ants. White ants being the local name for termites, which were quite a pest in India. All of this is to say that there is clearly the soundest historical precedent for footy pajamas. So by all means, pad forth with the blessing of new and language. In the early decades of the 20th century, dressing gowns, smoking jackets, slippers, and pajamas all became more popular as the growing middle class came to have more leisure to enjoy, and sartorial trappings of the good life became attainable tokens of aspirational success. This is the era when the weekend as we know it came to be, and when rising prosperity seemed to be floating all boats. The First World War knocked a lot of the stuffing out of the stratifications and dress codes of the old order, bringing upper and middle class style even closer into line. Classic loungewear probably reached its peak popularity in the 1930s, when escapist Hollywood movies brought high-class style to the masses and gave many people their first glimpse of how the other half lived and dressed behind closed doors. The Second World War temporarily slowed or suspended the production of luxuries like dressing gowns, but there was one rather unique item of loungewear that emerged from the highest authority. Winston Churchill had always been a bit of a clothes horse, and he never missed an opportunity for a costume change. So upon taking office as Prime Minister, he commissioned from London's finest tailors several one-piece jumpsuits. These were patterned on the rough wool serge battle dress uniforms being worn by Commonwealth troops, but rendered in rich jewel-toned velvet for lounging at 10 Downing Street, or chalk-striped woolen suiting for more official occasions. During the course of the Blitz, the Luftwaffe's 1940 bombing campaign against London, Churchill was often seen during air raids wearing his siren suits, an absolute picture of indomitable British spirit in the nation's darkest hour. It was not, however, a look that caught on. After the war, dressing gowns and their various accoutrements were aggressively marketed to a vast and rapidly growing demographic, fathers. Where the iconic image of the Victorian dressing gown wearer had been older and prosperous, and the interwar wearer had been young and louche, the post-war dressing gown was all about appealing to the wholesome comfort and gentle authority of dads. I suspect most people here had a father or a grandfather who went around the house wrapped in a cozy plaid wool dressing gown. Instead of the hard-soled velvet Albert slipper, he probably wore soft-soled leather slippers, well chewed by the family dog. And instead of boiled shirts and bow ties, he wore cozy cotton flannel pajamas. Every man's home may have been his castle, but this was the era of oppressive corporate conformity, as captured in The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. These guys went to work in suits and ties and hard leather shoes. Changing into robes and slippers when they got home marked a shift in their context, personality, and priorities, from worker and professional to husband and father. The most famous example of this transition is, of course, the one that Fred Rogers made at the beginning of each episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, when he carefully swapped out his jacket and wingtips for a zipper cardigan and sneakers. This wasn't classic loungewear, but it was in the same spirit, and it was in many respects its future. So a quick sidebar here to briefly consider sweaters for a moment, because although they have entirely different sartorial DNA from dressing gowns and Albert slippers, as leisure wear, they've permeated our culture far more. Sweaters were originally knit at home and worn by men who worked outside, notably fishermen. And they were largely regarded as unfashionably rustic and utilitarian until outdoor sports really started taking off in the late 19th century as an acceptable upper and middle class pastime. In England's damp and chilly climate, cricket, tennis, and bicycling all required warm and comfortable clothes that stretched with exertion. But sweaters didn't really take off as a fashion item in their own right until the 1920s, when trendsetter par excellence, the Duke of Windsor, took to wearing hand-knit Fair Isle sweaters, which quickly became an international obsession. They make appearances in menswear collections to this day, and of course, sweaters more generally have become one of the most popular items in a menswear landscape that's always getting more casual and comfortable. So getting back to loungewear proper, the dressing gown's post-war image was not just defined by dads, but also by cads. There is perhaps no person more closely associated with the garment than Hugh Hefner, and certainly no person is more responsible for its late 20th century image as the preferred gear of lubricious libertines. Here's the sophisticated elegance of the dressing. Here, the sophisticated elegance of the dressing gown was completely trumped by its aggressive decadence. Hefner made it less an icon of the establishment than a challenge to it. In time, of course, the sexual revolution that Hefner had helped bring about would leave him and his favorite garment behind as icons of unreformed machismo. The cut of dressing gowns and smoking jackets as we know them today hasn't fundamentally changed much from their Victorian predecessors, but the fabrics they're made from have changed with fashions over the decades. The 50s and 60s, for instance, saw the market saturated with various highly flammable, space-age synthetic silks that haven't aged particularly well. You'll find bales of those in secondhand stores and thrift shops across the world. The 70s are, of course, largely remembered for an especially notorious fashion dead end, the polyester leisure suit. I won't go into too much detail here because, despite their name, leisure suits really belong in the category of day wear rather than loungewear, if they belong anywhere, that is. Suffice it to say that they weren't very comfortable and probably smelled very bad. By far the most popular post-war variant of the dressing gown has been the plush cotton terry cloth bathrobe. But that's really a different garment altogether. And despite their ubiquity, they haven't made much of an impact on fashion aside from notable appearances in The Big Lebowski and The Sopranos. As an item of loungewear, it's best to think of the terry cloth bathrobe as a complement to boxers and a t-shirt. It really ties the outfit together. Today, the classically elegant dressing gown survives as a niche garment for especially stylish men who, like its original wearers, appreciate its comfort and contrast from their everyday clothing. They're an opportunity for men to play with brighter colors and bolder patterns in silkier fabrics than they'd feel comfortable wearing outside the home. For most aficionados, I'm sure there is the added appeal of dressing gowns being one of the oldest continuously worn garments in sartorial history, but you don't have to be a traditionalist to appreciate that there is something very elemental and sensual about them. More than with any other garment, you really inhabit the cloth of a dressing gown. You luxuriate in the handle and the drape of fine silk or cashmere. Once a man appreciates that, he tends to become a lifelong dressing gown wearer. It becomes a daily, maybe twice daily, pleasure that celebrates the comfort of home. Obviously, we've all been spending quite a bit of time in the comfort of our homes over the past year, so it'll come as no surprise that amid a pretty severe slump in the menswear market, loungewear has seen steady growth. Acknowledging that the majority of that growth has been in sweats and yoga pants, New England has also seen a surge of interest in our classic luxury loungewear, silk and cashmere dressing gowns, pajamas, slippers, and even smoking caps. Sweaters have also been a top seller. More than ever, comfort is king. The whole history of modern menswear is really a quest for ever greater comfort and informality, but there's no reason that comfort can't be classic and elegant as well. So I think I have just enough time before the Q&A session to show you all a short little video that I think is quite nice if you don't mind a little smoky menswear jazz soundtrack. It takes you inside the silk design and weaving process at the mill in Sudbury, England, where we have our exclusive silks made. As you'll see, it makes use of the most advanced modern technologies, but the underlying techniques are centuries old, and we'd like to think that the results are timeless. So later on, you'll see the process of how our silk gowns are then cut and trimmed by our English artisans. So without further ado, hold on. It's almost a shame to unpack something that's been packed that nicely. So maybe you should buy two, one to just sort of keep in the box on the shelf or something and another to wear. Anyway, that's all I've got for you tonight. Happy to take any questions you might have. And thank you very much.
Andrew, thank you so much. My goodness. The sound bites from today are extraordinary, and I think our wonderful audience will agree. Dandy versus fop, dad versus cad, rogue rocker. Terms, how would I say, mashups I would never have thought of before, but are so perfect. And thank you for going through all of this with us. Really beautifully done. And I just want to say, isn't it incredible to just see good craftsmanship in action? The last video I was just mesmerized by. I was like, yes, that's how fine garments are made.
Yeah,
just beautiful to see, and such a great behind the scenes look for all of us. So I have a few questions, and I know our audience has some amazing ones, which we're going to get to in one moment. You touched upon earlier that one expresses themselves in loungewear, or can express themselves in loungewear in a way that's a little bit different from their day-to-day. Would you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, again, going back to the 18th century, I think that's been the central defining aspect of loungewear. That whatever else it is not day wear. It is not something you wear out and about. It is not business clothes. It's stuff that you wear at home, that's comfortable and extravagant, and maybe more extravagant than your outward presenting personality. It's a place for you to indulge your inner fop, your inner sensualist. And I think not all gowns do this. I mean, there are lots of just very plain, sober, gray flannel gowns as well. But even those, it just wraps you up, and it's almost like a kid's garment. It's not something that you'd ever wear outside for more than picking up the newspaper. Some people do. I mean, that's a look you definitely see among certain, Instagram influencers, just wearing one of these robes out on the town, and that's cool too. I mean, once upon a time, people wouldn't have thought to wear Albert slippers that way, and that's quite a common thing now. But I think that's what it comes down to, is just it's a little role play, maybe, Westerners pretending to be Easterners, uptight company men pretending to be, decadent aesthetes, and not even pretending to be, maybe just getting in touch with the other side of themselves.
Nice, very nice. So we have a question from Catherine. Do you think that when the pandemic ends, that the comfort of PJs will transform workwear?
Well, that's really interesting, because it's a two-way dynamic. On one hand, you have work clothes inexorably getting more comfortable, more casual, but on the other hand, you also have clothes that once would have been considered purely lounge, sweatsuits, very loungy leisure wear, stuff like that, kind of being upgraded. So when you see a pair of wool flannel, drawstring waistband, elasticated trousers with like proper pockets, what is that? Is that an upgraded sweatpant, or is that a degraded trouser? It almost doesn't matter. What you're ending up with largely is something a bit in between. People have always wanted to be comfortable and ever more comfortable, but people also want to look good. And I think that's always going to be with us, especially now that we're not fighting sort of social conventions of stiff, starchy collars and, everything else. There's not really anything to push against. I hope that people will just decide that they want to look better.
I've been looking at the women's collections for fall 21, and there's a lot of influence of like smoking jacket style blazers. So we're definitely getting some flavor in that respect. And also just with the continuing of the the quote unquote smoking slipper that we're seeing, in everyday wear. In fact, Julie has a question. What is the difference between Albert shoes and loafers?
Well, that's a good question. A loafer is generally understood. It's a casual version of a hard leather men's dress shoe. So a loafer doesn't have laces. It's a slip-on. Sometimes they're called moccasins, but generally it's a slip-on dress shoe, where a slipper is. It's a fine line, but generally a slipper is made out of some sort of fabric, velvet or silk. Sometimes they're made of leather too, but the leather slippers that you see that I wear all the time, soft kind of suede soles, that's not a shoe. And a loafer is generally it's got a leather sole to it. You can wear it outside on a rainy day.
Thank you. Jessica writes, do we know when and why the term robe replaced dressing gown in Western culture?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to hazard a guess and say that a lot of guys didn't like wearing gowns. I think that probably changed around the time that men got a little bit more macho about it, and maybe that coincided too with it becoming a more democratized garment. An upper class sophisticate, would not mind wearing a dressing gown, but maybe like a middle class guy who just got one for Christmas, it's like, that's not a gown, that's a robe, and it's not pink, it's light red.
Rose asks if you're familiar with the shawl, and she says it's perfect for cabana wear.
Shawl. I'm not, I confess.
We have stumped our guest, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we've done it again.
Please boot her from the presentation, please.
Let me just see what else. These are great questions, by the way. And to answer the question that keeps coming up, yes, all of these programs are available on the National Arts Club YouTube channel afterward. Let's see. Oh, great question. Is the cutting of the materials the way that was shown in the video, is that typical in terms of the way is that typical across brands and so on?
Well, I can't speak to other brands. I will say that for any garment to be cut by hand by some old guy somewhere in England costs a fortune, and that translates to a pretty high expense for these things. But it is a selling point that these are made in England with traditional techniques and materials with our exclusively woven silks. So it's a selling point. You go to any major clothing place, there's no reason in the world not to have these cut, you know, with a stack 12 inches thick with a laser, you know. Mm-hmm. But that's not the way these are made. And, you know, these are not, they're not mass produced items. These are artisanally produced items.
So Martha gave a little recap, and one of the things she wrote is she's just curious that the smoking jacket is basically a descendant of the dressing gown.
Well, it's interesting because, you know, I hadn't really even thought of it that way until I was putting together this presentation, because I've always kind of thought of it as a version of a tuxedo. But the more I thought about it, it really has more DNA. It is to the dressing gown as the tuxedo is to tails. Like I put in the presentation. I think that, you know, nowadays we think of it as a type of jacket, but in all of its details, I don't know if you can see this one behind me, but the only thing that makes this not a dressing gown is the fact that it doesn't have the bottom 2 or 3 feet on it. So I think that's really where they came from.
Catherine asks, is there a feminine version of the dressing gown?
Well, I mean, and this is kind of what I was saying at the beginning, you know, all of these things have their feminine versions, and certainly females have worn the male version too. I mean, famously, you know, pajamas, dressing gowns, slippers. Obviously, slippers are not a gendered thing. And of course, the main difference between men's and women's garments, you know, the way they fold across each other, doesn't matter with the gown. You can do it either way. They've got pockets on both sides. So I'd say that any gown is pretty inherently a gender neutral garment.
Miriam asks if you know how long it takes to make a dressing gown from cut to finish.
You know, I don't really know off the top of my head. I mean, they're not nearly as complex a garment as like a suit coat or a sport coat. You know, there's not a whole lot of internal structure that goes on there, but you know, being hand cut and handmade slows things down a lot. So I couldn't tell you exactly, but.
Okay. Layla asks if you are seeing any and identifying any emerging trends in men's leisure wear.
Well, I mean, like I said, the big trend is leisure wear sort of bleeding into, I mean, no one calls it day wear anymore, but that's what I mean, stuff that people would wear out and about and eventually to work if we ever go back to work. And that's, you know, more, you know, finished trousers with drawstring waistbands or, you know, elasticated waistbands. Jackets have, for many years now, they've been progressively getting more and more deconstructed. You know, they're taking the structure out, they're taking the shoulder pads out. So now, you know, a lot of jackets and even suit jackets, they really wear like cardigans. And I would say that is, you know, very much in the tradition of a leisurely garment. And it's actually, you know, the sort of thing that we as a brand are also focusing more on with the cut of our garments, is making a more robe-like jacket. You know, I don't think that deconstructed thing is going away anytime soon. It would be a major shift of the fashion pendulum to go back to lots and lots of stiff structure. It might happen, but I don't see that happening. And I think that tailored clothing will be just fine without it.
So I have a big reveal right now. Rose has written back to tell us that the shawl is a terry cloth shirt that's also a towel, popular in the mid 20th century. So somewhat loungewear, right? Somewhat,
well, absolutely. So you like a terry cloth cabana shirt, like that sort of thing? Because
I don't. We will have to
Rose,
do a program just on that. That
okay.
will be next, right?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, Rose, because yeah, okay, exactly. Well, guess what? New in Lingwood is debuting this spring, terry cloth cabana shirts. So bingo.
Right on trend.
Well
right on trend.
Yep.
It's very funny. I remember having, when I was a teenager, a terry cloth polo shirt that I loved beyond belief. It's just a great summer fabric, and a little bit unexpected. So what I would also want to mention, Catherine Mensch asks, that earlier you showed images of dressing gowns over tighter day clothes, breeches, etc. Was that only to receive visitors? And did they take the breeches and vests off if they were alone or with family?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I think part of the beauty with loungewear, even going back that far, is that kind of all bets were off. I mean, what you did in your own home, like I said, I'm sure a lot of these guys were wearing them just for warmth. But I'm sure they were also, going commando under those things sometimes. It's not written in the history books how exactly these were worn. But one interesting thing, I know that there are reports we have of early Americans in the 18th century wearing them out and about town, linen versions in high summer as just walking out clothes, which I don't think happened in London or Europe, but America was always a little bit more casual, I guess. So, I think this was definitely a garment that you wore as and how you wanted to.
Interesting. And Alex asks if the red jacket behind you is a smoking jacket.
It is a smoking jacket. Let me bring it a little bit closer into view. So yeah, this is what you've got. This is a classic, Victorian Edwardian smoking jacket. You've got the silk quilted lapels. You've got the very intricate frogging for the button closures. Quilted cuffs. This is the sort of thing that you hang out with your other male buddies and smoke in. I don't know exactly when they became acceptable at the finest tables. Probably never at the finest tables, but they were like the tuxedo. It was kind of an outrage at the time that such a garment could be worn in polite company. But of course, all these things just, they formality crumbles away. And now this is probably one of the most formal garments any man would wear for fun. But that's the great thing about all these clothes. These are all clothes for fun. No one ever wore a smoking jacket for an interview. Or if they did, that's a hell of a job.
That is it. I'm trying to think what job that would be, but I will keep thinking about it. Perhaps we'll get back to it. I'm curious, Andrew, what in your viewpoint, what would you say the connotations or maybe the character traits of the individual who wears a dressing gown are?
Well, I would say that the single most important attribute I think you have to have is confidence. You have to have confidence in yourself, in yourself as a stylish person. In today's day and age, there are such sort of novelty garments in a way. Most people, will pass their days without ever coming within, without ever wearing a dressing gown. Certainly the kind of dressing gown that like we make, woven silk with quilted, velvet lapels. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary garment. And I think it takes some nerve to wear one at first. As much as we're talking about how they're cozy and comfortable, I mean, there is a line that you must cross, and once you cross it, it's no big deal, And I think being interested in clothes, and especially kind of more historical clothes, I've crossed many of those lines in the past. Right? It's like, oh, I'll never wear an ascot. Oh, that's going too far. Well, I wear ascots all the time now, and I think they're just fine, And it's just one of those things where everyone sort of figures out on their own. But the first step takes some confidence, I think.
Patty asks if you have any favorite classic Hollywood smoking jacket images.
Well, gee, I mean, it's hard to find a classic Hollywood movie that doesn't have some sort of smoking jacket or dressing gown in them. Those movies were so much about clothes, they were really the stars of the show. And I'm trying to think of one in particular that pops out. But man, I mean, I love seeing them in more modern period pieces too. It's just one of those garments. It's even nicer to see in color because they're so richly colored.
Exactly. We have a question about, and I've lost where it is, so I apologize. But asking about the pairing of a smoking jacket or dressing gown with a cravat, and where did that start, and what are the connotations around that look?
Well, it's a good question. When did it start? I think that there's one image in the slideshow. It's actually a 50s image of all things, with a dad being surprised by his family on Father's Day. And he's wearing a dressing gown, and underneath he's just got a pure white, like an aviator's silk scarf. And, that's a scarf like that would have been something that was worn in the 19th century as part of formal wear when you're going out in smoky, smoggy London. That's when you're wearing starched white tie and everything. You wore a scarf like that to protect your linen, to keep it from getting soiled. And that sort of thing definitely goes back to the 19th century. And the ascot, again, the ascot is something that sort of, it came out as a way for a gentleman to be more comfortable, but still not scandalously half naked with an open collar. So probably I want to say like the ascot really starts kind of happening in post World War I, 20s. Certainly by the 30s you see them a lot, but that was very much the idea. Like I'm not going to wear a tie, and an open collar is just a little bit not on. So an ascot sort of fills up that space, and especially for older men. And you got to remember, a lot of these clothing trends were driven by older men. It's nice to have something to keep your neck warm. It's nice to have something covering up your neck, frankly. And I think that's a lot of where it kind of got its association as sort of an old man garment, because it was the old men who were wearing them more often. The older men who didn't have to wear a tie to work. The Thurston Howell the Thirds. My Gilligan reference.
Very interesting. It's very interesting you bring this up, Andrew. The whole idea of trends coming from men who were older and more established. And if we look at our current, the current fashion world, it's very different now.
Absolutely.
It's extraordinary how in 100 years it has shifted completely, going the opposite direction.
It really has. It really has. I mean, I think that the I sort of mentioned this in the presentation about how different eras sort of had different associations and different ages associated with dressing gowns. And I think that, certainly I mean, you look back at the 1930s, the iconic 1930s that everyone's constantly going back to for reference of like the golden age of elegance for everything. And most of the illustrations are depicting middle-aged, often bald, often paunchy guys. I mean, those are the playboys of Palm Beach that everyone's trying to follow. It's
Yeah.
really interesting, like how our social icons have changed that way.
Fascinating. A few of our wonderful guests have typed in some of their favorite film smoking jacket dressing gown images, and Rose writes in David Suchet in the Poirot series. Nathalie writes in William Powell in The Thin Man. So those are two fabulous images that we can all take a look at. So Andrew, I'm curious if in terms of you showed us kind of an evolution of loungewear early on, from ancient times to last century till now. I'm just curious, do you feel there's going to be more evolution going forward?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think we'll always have evolution. If anything, it's going to be faster and faster as these things go. I will say that one thing that I didn't get around to putting into the presentation, which I think is really one of the things responsible for the current interest or the resurgence of interest in this sort of thing, is just our culture more generally being a bit more of a, not to be pretentious here, but kind of a postmodern mash of references. And like, we all have access to the past and different styles in a way that, the average person didn't used to anymore. And I think, we're now kind of compiling our notions of elegance from a much more varied palette, aesthetically, historically. And I think that is going to be when people look back on this era of fashion and style and culture, I think it's the distinguishing feature is going to be that sort of mishmashiness that like it's just, people are drawing their inspiration from so many other places. So you're not going to see the sort of focused evolution that has always been sort of the stock and trade of the fashion industry. Oh, hemlines are here this year and now they're there, that sort of thing. Ties are wider. That I don't think is ever going to happen. But now it's much more of a sort of a matrix. And I think some parts of the matrix will glow hotter in some years than others. And I think that's the way the evolution will happen.
Interesting. Going off that, Catherine writes, and this is yet another Catherine. We have a bevy of Catherines today. If you were to draw a futuristic sketch of loungewear in 50 or 100 years, do you have any idea what that sketch might look like?
Oh, wow. Huh. Well, here I really wish I had my colleague Matthew Carl Gale here with me, because he is a great menswear illustrator and is always downstairs. When there's no one in the shop, he's working on some sort of menswear illustration. And I think that would be a really good one to throw to him. So I might have to get back to you on that one. But I've never seen a fashion prediction that was correct. You know what I mean? I hope at some point we do go through a phase where everyone's wearing silver and sparkly things. I think, the future has to include like a Jetsons phase that we pass through, circles and stuff.
We finally have to go to the 1950s TV idea of what the future
yeah, that's got to
right?
happen. We've got to make that happen.
I will also mention that Patty is writing in for female fans of the smoking jacket, Miss Fisher's Mysteries, and the Frankie Drake Mysteries, and that there are some great images of women's wear inspired by smoking jackets. So thank you for that, Patty. Thank you for sharing all of those images.
I should mention, because I've seen a couple things pop up asking about whether or not we do women's robes. And as I said, any robe can be a women's robe, but we also do have a variety of dedicated women's robes. Some are more kimono style, some are more traditional robes. And those are all done as made to measure garments. So if anyone's interested, they can come in, they can go through the silk books, they can pick their fabric. we can make them up a truly beautiful gown. I didn't really have time in the presentation to discuss women's stuff, largely, as I say, because I don't know it that well. And we are primarily a menswear store, but that is one thing we do offer for women. So.
Wonderful. Andrew, one last question, and that is, how do you feel about this idea of innerwear wearing it out, meaning wearing pajamas on the street? And as you said earlier, you're talking about a influencer wearing a dressing gown, walking down the street. I'm not asking you to critique it. I'm asking, what is your personal viewpoint on it?
Personally, I like dressing for occasions and contexts. I love living in New York because we have all 4 seasons. I like wearing, a pajamas and a robe at home and a suit to work. I like having all those distinctions. I like making all those distinctions with my clothes. I think that's part of the fun of clothes. So personally, it's not fun for me to the idea of wearing pajamas out like that. I'm not interested. As I said, there's nothing to push against. No one's judging you anymore if you do something like that. You're not like a rebel if you wear a dressing gown out and about. I just think that, I like the history of all different garments, and I like, respecting their traditions. And obviously you can play with them, but I guess I like to dress specifically and to the purpose, and with some honestly, with a lot of respect for the tradition. I do love that stuff.
Well, we so appreciate the fact that you love dressing for the occasion and therefore are such an expert on it. Thank you so much for joining us and inspiring us today. I want to thank our audience for their fantastic questions. And Andrew, we must have you on again. We will talk. And I just want to say, for those of you not familiar with the National Arts Club, you can find us at nationalartsclub.org or on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. I'm David Zyla, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.